No matter how old we are, we never outgrow the need to ask questions. The truth is, we just don't know all the answers. And most of us go to Google with our questions. Just think about the things you've Googled. I mean, questions like, what time is it in China? How old is Kanye West? And how do I spell Massachusetts? But here's the thing. We can't find every answer we're looking for on Google. Wait, I take that back. Maybe we can, but we may not always get a clear answer. I once Googled, are blueberries good for you? And I got 10 answers like 10 proven health benefits of blueberries. And then out of curiosity, I Googled, are blueberries bad for you? And I got answers like the health risks of eating blueberries. I mean, for real. Now that's a totally random example, but you get my point. We are wired to look for answers. And usually the topics of our biggest questions are more intense than the health benefits of blueberries. We may wonder things like, why am I here? And who are my people? And what am I supposed to do with my life? And hunting for answers to questions like this can get complicated. That's why for the next few weeks, we're going to spend some time discussing some big questions. And the goal is that by the end of this series, we'll not only become more comfortable asking questions, but we'll also grow closer to other people with whom we can ask those questions. To start off, we're going to ask a more churchy question. Whether you attend church regularly or not, maybe you've wondered, what does it mean to follow Jesus? I mean, some people would say that our answer to this question changes everything about our lives. And if that's true, then yes, this is a big question. However, if you've watched 5 different TikToks or 5 different YouTube videos, you'd get 5 different answers for what that means. And when there are multiple possible answers to a question, it can be sort of confusing. In fact, let's take a quick look at what Google suggests as the answer to that question. Recognizing him for who he really is, responding to his call, having a life of prayer, stopping worrying, studying the Bible every day, use this kind of Bible, play this kind of music, pray for 15 hours a week, dress like this, talk like that, and spend their time like such. My point is that a lot of people have a different opinion about what it looks like to follow Jesus. But here's what's difficult about this. If we say the answer to this question, what does it mean to follow Jesus, could change everything for us. But then the answers we find online are shallow, then why follow Jesus at all? In fact, we aren't even sure God really does much of anything for our lives other than making our social media bio look better or giving us something to do for a few hours on the weekend. For a lot of people, Jesus just kind of lives off to the side of their real life. And every once in a while, it might cross their mind. But for some of you, that's maybe why you don't follow Jesus at all, because you don't really see how following would change much of anything for you. And so then, what's the point? In other words, if following Jesus doesn't seem to really change anything for you in your life, then it makes sense why you wouldn't want to follow him in the first place. I get it. See, people have been asking what it means to follow Jesus for a long time. And people are asking it now. And people were asking it thousands of years ago when Jesus showed up. In the Gospels, the books of the Bible that tell us about Jesus' life, we're given an inside look at what following Jesus is all about. One day, as Jesus was walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon, also called Peter, and Andrew, throwing a net into the water, for they fished for a living. Now Jesus called out to them, "Come, follow me, and I will show you how to fish for people." And at once they left their nets and followed him. Back in that time period, religious leaders, not just Jesus, had disciples. And disciples were people who followed teachers or leaders around them to learn. Disciples kind of found their identity in being associated with a certain teacher because of what that teacher taught. And surely Peter and Andrew wondered what made Jesus different from these other teachers, and probably wondered things like, where would following this teacher take me? And how long is this going to be? Jesus answers by basically saying, follow me and watch the way I live my life. Watch how I do things, and then go and do the same. And when you do that, you know what will happen? Instead of people who pull fish out of the water, you'll spend your time inviting humans to know God better and be who God has made them to be. I'll bring out of you a new way of living and being in the world. And what Jesus offered was enough to inspire Andrew and Peter to go with him. And they left their fishing nets, their careers, their identities, their community, and they followed Jesus. A bunch of other women and men joined them as they went. And what I want us to really notice is that Jesus didn't have them first pass a Bible test, ask them if they were religious, or ask around to find out how good their behavior was. tell them that they were going to be better than other people. Jesus didn't do any of that. He simply invited them to follow in his footsteps and do as he did, talk as he talked, and love as he loved. Jesus invited them to go where he went so they could be more like him. And the thing is, when they left their nets, their families, and their way of doing life, they were probably filled with a ton of questions like, where are we going? How's all this going to turn out? For those of you who are familiar with the life of Jesus, it can be easy to forget that when Jesus started out, no one knew how the story would unfold. No one could have anticipated how it would all go down. As far as they knew, Jesus was just another interesting religious teacher. Fast forward 3 years, and throughout their time together, these disciples would see Jesus walk on water, heal the sick, and raise people from the dead. They would hear him speak and watch him forgive sins, and they would see him arrested and sentenced to death without even putting up a fight. And finally, after 3 days of being dead and buried, they'd see him alive again. Things that they would have never imagined could happen. What's also crazy is what following Jesus meant to the disciples after Jesus was gone. Peter eventually becomes the first leader of the church. Except for John, every one of Jesus' closest disciples died defending their love and faith in Jesus and what he represented. Thousands of years later, we're still looking at their stories, learning from them, and even naming our children after them. When Jesus asked them to follow, they had no idea what they would do and who they would become. But God knew. God had a life in mind for them that was bigger than the life they were currently living. And Jesus had more in mind for who they'd become and more in mind for the relationships they would have. He had more in mind for how much they would matter in the world. Their biggest life questions found answers bigger and better than they would have ever dreamed of from their boats. You could say it this way. Jesus had more in mind for their lives in the areas that mattered most. And in the same way, Jesus has more in mind for our lives in the areas that matter most. If we had asked Andrew and Peter and the other disciples, what does it mean to follow Jesus at the beginning? They wouldn't have known, but they knew enough to take one step at a time. They knew they didn't have to have everything figured out on day one. They just had to commit one day at a time, one step at a time to following Jesus and his example. And in doing that, they began to live out what following Jesus meant. And as a result, they found more purpose and direction. They found better relationships. They had more joy and peace, and they found something worth giving their lives to. They found answers to what they were looking for, and we can too. Think of it this way. When you really understand who Jesus is, it changes everything. Following Jesus can help us answer our biggest questions, because if Jesus has more in mind for our lives in the areas that matter most, then following him will lead to clarity in those areas. For the disciples, Jesus was a life-changing adventure that completely made a difference in who they were and who they would become. Jesus changed their lives in the best way possible. Sure, he taught them so many things about life and even their behavior, but more than that, Jesus loved them and served them. To them, following Jesus wasn't about a religion and a bunch of rules. It wasn't about a social media aesthetic or about following secondhand information from other people who claimed to know Jesus. To them, it was a personal experience and a life-changing encounter with Jesus himself. It was a spiritual journey that led them to richer, deeper, more fully human lives than they could ever imagine. But what about us? We can't be physically present with Jesus like they were. So what can we do? And whether you are already following Jesus or just thinking about it, here are a few things that I think we can do to get started. Start reimagining what following Jesus looks like. Consider asking yourself a few things. Has my view of following Jesus become too small? Have I reduced it to a bunch of rules or lists of do's and don'ts? And what if it's bigger than that? What if it's an adventure? What if it's life-changing? And what if it's the friendship I've always wanted? Reimagine it, write it down, talk about it, and begin to visualize it in a new way. Take a step. Follow the example of Andrew and Peter. They simply took a step to follow Jesus. And they left their nets. They didn't know what would happen with their lives. They just trusted Jesus enough to take one step at a time. And so what would a step look like for you? Don't overwhelm yourself with all the steps to get 3 or 4 years down the road. Start with just one single thing, one single step. And maybe you start by getting honest with God and opening up about some of the questions you have. Maybe it would mean having a conversation with your small group leader or another adult you trust about what's going on in your life. And maybe it's just showing up here consistently or engaging with your small group. Maybe it would cost you something. Maybe it would be worth it. Identify your next step and then be bold enough to take it. Think about these 3 questions. Who am I? Where do I fit in? And can I make a difference? Over the next few weeks, we're going to look at these and dig into these questions. Following Jesus can help us as we learn to answer these questions. And Jesus isn't just a separate category in our lives. He's part of figuring all of this out. Invite Jesus into the process. See what Jesus has to say about the biggest questions you have about yourself. You may be surprised by what you discover. And so spend some time thinking about those questions. Jesus has more in mind for our lives in the areas that matter most. Imagine if we could really fully understand this. What if we could see that following Jesus is life-changing? What if we quit seeing it as a list of religious rules and start seeing it as bigger than that? And what if we trusted that following Jesus can help us answer our biggest questions? We have no idea where that journey will take us, but neither did Andrew and Peter, and it took them places beyond what they could imagine. As you head out today, remember that this is one of the reasons why we have small groups. We want to have a safe place for you to ask these big questions with other people who are asking the same sorts of things. We want the opportunity to learn from each other and encourage one another as we figure out what following Jesus is all about.